Among Europe's empires, Germany was the most recently formed, having been birthed onto the world stage in the aftermath of the defeat of France in 1871. The German Empire was a federal state, and also a parliamentary democracy struggling to be born, as the power struggle between the autocratic tendencies of the sovereign and the House of Parliament, the Reichstag, was a major point of contention in German politics ever since. In popular politics, the center and the left were the dominant forces. As a new wave of industrialization hit the rapidly urbanizing Germany, support for social democracy and socialism surged among the growing working class. However, low popularity did not mean that the right had no influence in German politics. The Altdeutsche Verband was a marginal movement of extreme right-wing nationalists, but had big support among the ruling class and high influence in political machinations of the government. It was part of what was described by the umbrella term Völkische Bewegung, or People's Movement. An ultra-nationalistic, racist, and anti-Semitic school of thought which sought to incorporate all Germans in Europe into a greater Germany. The German Empire was a semi-constitutional monarchy. The emperor by 1910 was Wilhelm II of House Hohenzollern. Despite the legacy of Otto von Bismarck, his age started having a negative impact on his ability to work as a statesman. The Kaiser's choice fell on Bethmann Hollweg, so that he could have a strong hand in the Reichstag. On the international scene, Germany found itself in alliance with the much older Austro-Hungarian Empire, a manifestation of the old post-Napoleonic order, an order of congresses and concerts. Another young nation, Italy, was also a German ally. In many ways, the two were similar, sharing colonialist ambitions in the world outside of Europe. But the key difference is that Germany and Germans themselves had a long history of military traditions and Protestant work ethic, creating a state with the actual capability to take what it wants. Germany's colonial ambitions and attempts to influence those around them since 1871 have created some enemies. France was a sworn enemy, whom Bismarck's foreign policy attempted to contain and isolate since the Franco-Prussian War. But Wilhelm's strong German nationalism and sympathy for Austria has caused a rift with Russia, which was itself a sworn enemy of Austria and the Habsburg dynasty since the Crimean War. As time went on, it became clearer that war was constantly just around the corner. So not only was the military becoming bigger through army expansion bills and construction, but so was the fleet, the Kaiser's personal plaything, despite the mounting costs of expanding and maintaining it. But Admiral Tirpitz was absolutely supportive of Wilhelm's naval enthusiasm. But despite the growing aura of prestige around the army, this did not magically translate into popular support for it, let alone for war. This was demonstrated by what became known as the Zabern Affair, when the Prussian officer retaliated against the locals for supposedly disrespecting the imperial uniform. Government inaction and unwillingness to punish the officer showed to all Germans that despite the empire being a federation of equals, Prussians, especially in the army, will always be more equal than the rest. The War Council was assembled. Helmut von Moltke the Younger proposed a reformed version of the Schlieffen Plan. Instead of invading the entire Benelux region, the flanking maneuver around the French border defenses would be streamlined into Luxembourg and Belgium, to focus maximum quantity of firepower in a single sector. An invasion of Congress Poland would be abandoned, as was believed that the Russian Imperial Army would take too long to mobilize, leading Germany's military minds to conclude that until the Russian army arrives in the field, France will already have been defeated. On June 29th, the Austrian heir to the throne was assassinated in Bosnia. A crisis ensued. Nations of the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente mobilized their armies. All the built-up tensions over the years were now boiling over into full-scale war in Europe. The years of anticipation and preparation were now culminating into action. The ultimatum was issued to Belgium. The Belgian king refused, leading to a German invasion.
Der Tod reitet auf einen kohlschwarzen Rappen, trägt ein undurchsichtig Kappen. Wenn Landsknecht in das Feld marschieren, lässt sein Ross daneben galoppieren. Flandern in Not, in Flandern reitet der Tod, in Flandern reitet der Tod. Der Tod reitet auf einem lichten Schimmel, schön wie ein Cherubim vom Himmel. Wenn Mädchen ihren Reigen schreiten, will mit ihnen im Tanze gleiten. Fa la la la, fa la la la. Der Tod kann auch die Trommel rühren, du kannst den Wirbel im Herzen spüren. Der trommelt lang, der als den ersten Wirbel geschlagen, da hat's das Blut vom Herzen getragen. Als den zweiten Wirbel schlug, den Landsknecht Mann zu graben. Flandern in Not, Flandern reiten der Tod, in Flandern reiten der Tod. Verdammt! Der Landsknecht von Gott seinen Segen empfangen. Der dritte Wirbel ist heiß und klingt, als wie eine Mutter nach ihr klingt. La 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 la. Scheiße! Das tut weh!
By late August of 1914, the Imperial Army could only reach the Arras-Cambrai-Sedan line in northeastern France. The Schlieffen plan failed despite the initial success. Both sides began entrenching and fortifying themselves. At first, everyone believed that trenches were a temporary state of affairs. But as time went on, it became self-evident that this was going to be the status quo on the Western Front. Things were much more fluid on the Eastern Front, where the Russians have unexpectedly been able to invade some sectors of East Prussia. The general tasked with defending the eastern flank, von Prittwitz, was dismissed for his defeatist attitude and demanding a retreat beyond the Vistula, giving up Königsberg in the process. He was replaced with a duo that would end up setting the tone for this front, Paul von Hindenburg and Erich Ludendorff. In April of 1915, the German army began major offensive action in Poland. By September, Warsaw was finally captured. Seeing how the Russians were struggling to hold their positions in Poland, the French decided to commence an offensive around the French city of Verdun in hopes of beating the Germans off the heights around it. This would prove to be among the bloodiest battles waged on the static Western Front. The Battle of Verdun lasted from the 9th of September to the 15th of February. Many terrifying weapons were used in the struggle for a few hills. Machine guns, flamethrowers, poison gas, armored cars, and many miles of barbed wire. In the end, it would claim the lives of 377,000 Frenchmen and 337,000 Germans. As the battle raged on, reports on the German home front about the struggle became more and more fatalistic. even with the heavy-handed censorship, as bodies kept piling up, no results to show for it.
Right moments, and as if to prove all I have said, here is one of the first to go. A lad who sat before me on these very benches, who gave up all to serve in the first year of the war. One of the iron youth who have made Germany invincible in the field. Look at him, sturdy and bronzed and clear-eyed, the kind of soldier every one of you should envy. Oh, lad, you must speak to them. You must tell them what it means to serve your fatherland.
No, I can't tell them anything.
You must, Paul. Just a word. Just tell them how much they're needed out there. Tell them why you went, what it meant to you.
I can't say anything.
If you remember some deed of heroism, some touch of nobility, tell about it.
I can't tell you anything you don't know. We live in the trenches out there. We fight. We try not to be killed. Sometimes we are. That's all.
No. No, Paul.
I've been there. I know what it's like.
But that's not what one dwells on, Paul.
I heard you in here reciting that same old stuff. Making more iron men, more young heroes. You still think it's beautiful and sweet to die for your country, don't you? Well, we used to think you knew. The first bombardment taught us better. It's dirty and painful to die for your country. When it comes to dying for your country, it's better not to die at all. There are millions out there dying for their countries. And what good is it?
Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Russians were getting pushed back even more. In April, the effects of the British naval blockade have taken a toll on Germany and her people. The lack of food imports forced the common people to resort not only to slaughtering their farm animals, but also pigeons and ravens. The symbol of these shortages became turnip, as it quickly became everyone's go-to for replacing meat in their diets, when even all pigeons were eaten. This war would either be ended by a German victory, or the war will end Germany. However, there were some good news. The Tsar of all Russia, Nicholas II, cousin of the German Kaiser, under mounting political pressure and military defeats, abdicated the imperial throne.
Noch so viel, not enough, auch mit Vergnügen nehme ich noch all diese Leben an mich. We all are buzzing up, dein Instinkt wird es schreien, lass dich einfach selber rein. We are buzzing up, halt die Klauen nicht zurück, wer weiß, wer sich du oder ich.
October 1st, Moscow had fallen before the might of German arms. The next day, Petrograd. Russia was truly on the brink. Seeing the deteriorating situation at the front, and the provisional government's ineptitude at military and political decision-making, a second coup happened in Russia. A group of communists under the leadership of one Vladimir Lenin Very quickly, Ukraine proclaimed independence, becoming a German puppet. Some relief could now come to the hungry German people, as finally there was a source of wheat for actual bread. By April, seeing how he has no cards to play, and how Russia lost all territories with any industry, Lenin had no choice but to agree to peace on German terms. Now, the OHL had the troops to redeploy to the west, but they had to hurry, as the soldiers and civilians could only fight on for so much longer. The thing that was feared by German elites so much was starting to materialize. Calls for reform and curtailing the Kaiser's power were only growing louder. On October 10th of 1917, Operation Mikhail began. The German Empire is now throwing everything at the enemy in attempts to reach Paris. By March of 1918, the German army was only able to take back Arras. Operation Mikhail was a complete disaster. However, the OHL still believed that there was still a fight left in the soldiers. Thus on March 18th, Operation Georgette began.
dieses Land. Auf zum Schlachtfeld, auf zur Front und auf.
By September, Saint-Quentin was outflanked in the east. This was far from the first attempt to storm this town, but the entrenched British forces continued to hold the line.
Verlaubt triumphieren Aufschrei, schreitet nun voran, aufwärmen die wir bauen auf, leiten unter uns, bis hoch zum Himmelsfeld. Feuersperr vor der Feuerlast, Feuersperr vor der Feuerlast, die Angst vor Gewalt, so genauer hinweist, ein Feuerwerk auf tut, das nur so umherfliegt. Schau wie schön es fließt, niemals könnt ich aufhören.
On the 11th of November of 1918, the situation became obviously untenable, with Germany's allies falling apart one after another. Bulgaria was on the brink, the Ottomans have been out of the fight for a few years now, and Austria-Hungary was collapsing like a house of cards. It could no longer be denied. The war was lost. There was only one correct course of action anymore: surrender. In the chaos of the last days of the war, the Kaiser abdicated, with Germany becoming a republic with its first president, Friedrich Ebert. The Great War claimed the lives of 22 million people, both soldiers and civilians alike. But even before the final peace deal was signed by the victors, dissident communists and socialists began an uprising in Berlin. The Spartacus Bund was up in arms, demanding violent revolution. When the Treaty of Versailles was finally signed in February of 1919, with huge financial aid from Bolshevik Moscow, German communists started their own uprising, plunging Germany into civil war just like Russia.
Treu bis zur letzten Stunde, treu deutschen Pflichtgebot, traf die Todeswunde mit fest verschlossenem Munde. Gehst du für deutsche Not, traf dich die Todeswunde mit fest verschlossenem Munde. Gehst du für bei deines Namens Klang. Du sollst den Sinn uns lenken, wir wollen dein Gedenken das ganze Leben lang. Du sollst den Sinn uns lenken.
But the many war veterans coming back from the front were quick to take up arms again, now against communist civilians. However, these were not any veterans. They were no longer soldiers, but bands of traumatized combat veterans who have nothing to return to in civilian life, because not only did they join the army at a young age before they could have their own civilian lives, but also hyperinflation destroyed the savings of millions across the country, resulting in most veterans being unable to find civilian jobs, thus having nothing to do but having a rifle in hand to hunt down anyone they held responsible for their misery and defeat in the war. These combat veterans were the Freikorps. Despite the desire of Ebert to disband these right-wing radicals too, the Civil War proved that the new Reichswehr and the Freikorps were too important to let go, lest the communists raise their banners again. Thus, the radical right once again took its place as the deep state in Germany. But now, all the sophisticated German associations became rabble-rousers themselves. The government could not ban them either, as they were protected by the Freikorps and army, commanded by Walter von Lüttwitz. De facto, Germany was a stratocracy, with Ebert as its face for the international community. But in reality, people like Walter Lüttwitz, Rudolf Sebottendorf, Hermann Ehrhardt, Anton Drexler, Wolfgang Kapp, and Dietrich Eckert ran the country from the shadows, just as the Alldeutsche Verband once did before the war. But now it was replaced by far more radical groups: Ehrhardt's organization Konsul and the Thule Gesellschaft. Time went by, the threat of communist takeover was more and more distant. The radical right consolidated its power over the state. Eventually, in 1932, the de facto became de jure, as in yet another but final fake election, a fiery orator and popular demagogue, Adolf Hitler, became Chancellor. There was nothing President Hindenburg could do against the growing tide of folkish nationalism and the ideology of National Socialism.
To carry out the obligations of the office of Chancellor without party interests and for the good of the nation.
I do.
And do you further swear to uphold the Constitution, support the President, and respect the right of the Reichstag? So help you God.
I do.
Our shield will guide in war.
Immediately upon assuming power, other men around Hitler began disappearing, only to be found dead. Some died of natural causes like Wolfgang Kapp. Some were thrown into concentration camps like him and Erhard. But even those who turned Hitler into what he is began disappearing too. The man who brought Hitler into the German Workers' Party back in the early 20s, Anton Drexler, was assassinated. The man who curated his natural oratory skills and megalomania, Dietrich Eckart, drank himself to death upon seeing what kind of monster he created. Those who stood between him and absolute power, like Walter Lüttwitz, were found dead too. And Rudolf Sebottendorf simply vanished, never to be seen again, most likely escaping the long hand of the SS. This purge of the deep state, known as Unternehmen Kolibri, made it clear to everyone, both within and outside of Germany, that Hitler's rise to power just meant that there will be a new war in the coming years. Back when the Treaty of Versailles was finalized and signed, the French General Ferdinand Foch expressed his dismay at how he believed the treaty was too lenient. This is no peace. This is an armistice for 20 years.